Asterisk never confront. Never warn. Just outplay. 7 rules to outsmart manipulators. Chased. Most people lose long before the argument ever begins. Not because they are less intelligent. Not because they lack confidence. They lose because they unknowingly accept the game the manipulator has designed. The moment you start defending yourself against accusations that were carefully engineered to provoke you, you've stepped onto a playing field where someone else wrote the rules. Manipulation is rarely loud in the beginning. It is subtle. It arrives disguised as concern, humor, curiosity, generosity, or coincidence. It asks innocent questions that reveal far more about you than you intended to share. It encourages emotional reactions while carefully hiding its own intentions. It rewards impulsive decisions because impulsive people are easier to predict. One of the biggest misconceptions about manipulation is that it always looks aggressive. In reality, many skilled manipulators appear calm, friendly, generous, and remarkably patient. They understand something important. People lower their defenses around those who seem emotionally controlled. That means your greatest advantage is not becoming more aggressive. Your advantage is becoming more difficult to read. Imagine playing chess against someone who can see every move you're planning, while you know nothing about theirs. That is what happens when you constantly reveal your frustrations, fears, ambitions, insecurities, and emotional triggers to someone who collects information without offering much of themselves. People often think honesty requires complete transparency. It doesn't. Honesty means what you say is true. It does not require volunteering every thought, every plan, or every emotional reaction to every person you meet. Emotion is information. Every visible emotional reaction teaches observant people something. If a joke immediately angers you, someone learns where your pride is attached. If criticism makes you desperate to explain yourself, someone discovers how easily you can be pulled into defending your identity. If praise instantly changes your behavior, someone learns how inexpensive your approval can become. This doesn't mean you should suppress emotions until they disappear. Healthy emotional awareness matters. The goal is different. The goal is choosing when, where, and with whom your emotions become visible. That is self-control. The first rule is simple. Never reward manipulation with immediate emotional access. Many people assume that every accusation deserves an answer. It doesn't. Every criticism does not deserve a defense. Every insult does not require a response. Silence often reveals more than explanation ever could. Manipulative people frequently rely on urgency. They create emotional deadlines. Answer me right now. If you cared, you'd decide immediately. Why are you hesitating? Pressure is often more informative than the words themselves. When someone becomes uncomfortable because you are taking time to think, ask yourself why. Healthy people usually appreciate thoughtful decisions. Manipulative people often fear them. Thinking interrupts emotional momentum. And emotional momentum is one of the strongest tools manipulation has. Consider how frequently poor decisions happen during heightened emotion. Anger, excitement, fear, romantic attraction, embarrassment, panic. Manipulators understand that the emotional brain acts faster than the analytical brain. That is why slowing the pace changes everything. Simple phrases become powerful. I'll think about it. Let me get back to you tomorrow. I haven't decided. I need more information. These responses appear ordinary. Psychologically, they accomplish something much bigger. They prevent another person from controlling your timeline. Control over timing often becomes control over outcomes. The second rule is to become difficult to predict. Predictability creates leverage. If someone knows exactly how you'll react every time they criticize you, flatter you, ignore you, or challenge you, they no longer need to guess. Your behavior becomes programmable. That doesn't mean behaving randomly. It means responding intentionally instead of automatically. Automatic reactions belong to habits. Intentional responses belong to awareness. Awareness notices emotional shifts before behavior begins. I notice I'm becoming defensive. I notice I'm trying to impress this person. I notice I suddenly feel guilty. That moment of awareness creates space. Inside that space exists freedom. Without awareness, manipulation becomes much easier, because your behavior runs on emotional autopilot. One overlooked habit of emotionally resilient people is curiosity. Instead of immediately reacting, they observe. Why was that question asked? Why did the conversation suddenly change? Why did praise arrive immediately before a request? Patterns matter more than isolated moments. Almost anyone can behave selfishly once. Almost anyone can lose patience. Manipulation usually appears as repeated patterns. Repeated guilt. Repeated confusion. Repeated pressure. repeated reversals, repeated emotional instability that always seems to benefit one person. When confusion becomes chronic, clarity usually isn't the manipulator's goal. Confused people seek guidance. Dependent people surrender decisions. This is why clarity becomes a form of protection. Write things down. Summarize conversations. Confirm agreements. Ask specific questions. Ambiguity often benefits whoever intends to rewrite history later. Memory becomes surprisingly unreliable when emotion increases. Written clarity reduces unnecessary conflict while protecting everyone involved. The third rule is to stop trying to win every conversation. Many people unknowingly become trapped because they believe every false accusation must be too corrected. Imagine someone insists the sky is green. Would proving them wrong necessarily improve your life? Probably not. Some conversations exist only to consume your energy. Attention itself becomes the reward. Not every invitation deserves acceptance. Sometimes declining to participate is the strongest position available. Walking away is different from surrendering. Walking away recognizes that not every conflict produces value. Some arguments have no finish line because agreement was never the objective. The objective was emotional exhaustion. There is another principle worth remembering. Confidence rarely announces itself. Insecurity usually does. People who constantly advertise their intelligence often seek validation. People who repeatedly remind others of their authority often fear losing it. People obsessed with appearing powerful frequently depend upon appearances more than substance. Observe actions before believing words. Consistency remains one of the strongest indicators of character. Anyone can perform confidence briefly. Consistency requires something deeper. When words repeatedly conflict with actions, believe the pattern rather than the promise. Trust develops through repetition. So does distrust. The fourth rule is protecting your attention. Attention functions like currency. Whatever consistently receives it becomes psychologically significant. Manipulators often attempt to dominate attention through constant emergencies, emotional unpredictability, manufactured conflict, or endless drama. Notice how draining some conversations become. You leave feeling mentally exhausted, despite accomplishing almost nothing. That exhaustion isn't always accidental. Emotion consumes cognitive resources. The more overwhelmed your mind becomes, the less carefully you evaluate information. Mental fatigue increases suggestibility. That is why maintaining routines matters. Regular sleep, exercise, quiet reflection, healthy relationships, purposeful work. These habits strengthen emotional regulation, making impulsive decisions less likely. Resilience isn't built during crisis. It is prepared beforehand. The stronger your internal stability becomes, the harder external pressure works against you. Manipulation succeeds most easily when identity depends upon someone else's approval. People who know who they are become much harder to control because disagreement no longer feels like personal annihilation. They can hear criticism without collapsing. They can receive praise without becoming addicted to it. They can tolerate uncertainty without rushing toward premature conclusions. That emotional steadiness changes every interaction. It communicates something powerful without saying a word. My decisions are not available for purchase through fear, guilt, or flattery. Manipulators rarely announce defeat. They usually become less interested when predictable emotional rewards disappear. Not because you've defeated them through confrontation, because the investment stopped producing reliable returns. There is a quiet misconception that confidence is something people either have or they don't. In reality, confidence is often the result of repeated evidence that you can regulate yourself under pressure. Every time you pause instead of reacting impulsively, you reinforce the belief that your emotions belong to you. That changes the way you carry yourself, the way you make decisions, and the way other people respond to you. Most manipulators are not searching for the strongest person in the room. They are searching for the most reactive one. Reaction creates information. Information creates leverage. Leverage creates influence. When you understand that sequence, your priorities begin to shift. Instead of focusing on appearing impressive, you begin focusing on becoming internally stable. Stability is difficult to manipulate because it doesn't depend on external validation. Think about conversations you'd well have had where someone seemed determined to get a specific reaction from you. Maybe they interrupted repeatedly. Maybe they questioned your competence in front of others. Maybe they made subtle comparisons designed to provoke insecurity. If you responded exactly as they anticipated, they gained something valuable. They learned which emotional buttons produced immediate results. Now imagine responding differently. Not cold, not hostile. Simply composed. A brief pause. A measured answer. Or even a calm, "That's an interesting perspective." Suddenly, the predictable pattern disappears. People who rely on emotional disruption often become uncertain when disruption no longer works. This leads to another important principle. You don't have to convince everyone that you're right. Many people waste enormous amounts of energy trying to correct every misunderstanding. They believe that if they explain themselves one more time, the other person will finally become reasonable. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it isn't. There is a difference between misunderstanding and unwillingness. A misunderstanding can usually be resolved through patience and clarity. An unwillingness to understand is a completely different situation. No amount of explanation can persuade someone who benefits from misunderstanding you. Learning to recognize that distinction protects your energy. Energy is one of your most valuable resources. Every hour spent defending yourself against bad faith accusations is an hour not invested in your work, your relationships, your health, or your growth. Strategic people become selective about where they invest attention. Not every battle deserves participation. Not every criticism deserves analysis. Not every opinion deserves emotional weight. One useful question is this: does responding move me closer to the life I want? If the answer is no, silence often becomes the wiser choice. Silence is frequently misunderstood. Some people interpret it as weakness because they assume strength always looks loud. But there is another kind of strength. The strength to remain calm while others become emotional. The strength to delay judgment until more information appears. The strength to refuse invitations into unnecessary conflict. That kind of discipline is difficult because it requires tolerating discomfort without immediately escaping it. Most impulsive reactions exist for one reason. They reduce temporary discomfort. You explain yourself because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. You apologize too quickly because tension feels uncomfortable. You agree to something you don't want because disappointing someone feels uncomfortable. Short-term comfort often creates long-term problems. Learning to tolerate temporary discomfort creates long-term freedom. This becomes especially important when someone attempts to manufacture guilt. Healthy guilt appears when you've genuinely violated your own values. Manufactured guilt appears when someone wants you to feel responsible for emotions, expectations, or outcomes that were never yours to carry. The difference matters. Imagine someone says, "If you really cared about me, you would do this." Instead of immediately defending yourself or giving in, pause. Ask yourself, is this request reasonable? Am I being asked to violate my own priorities? Is affection being used as a bargaining tool? Questions create psychological distance. Distance reduces emotional pressure. Pressure narrows thinking. Space expands it. The fifth rule is to become comfortable with disappointing people. This doesn't mean becoming insensitive. It means accepting an unavoidable reality. No one can consistently honor their own values without occasionally disappointing someone else's expectations. If your greatest fear is making people unhappy, your decisions become easy to influence. Boundaries begin where the need for universal approval ends. One of the simplest boundaries is also one of the most difficult. No. Notice how often people instinctively soften it. "I'm sorry. I wish I could. Maybe later." Sometimes those responses are appropriate. Sometimes they become habits designed to reduce the discomfort of saying no. A respectful refusal does not always require an elaborate explanation. Over-explaining often reveals uncertainty. Clear communication usually sounds surprisingly simple. "I won't be able to do that. I've decided against it. That doesn't work for me." Calm. Respectful. Complete. Notice something interesting. People who respect boundaries usually adjust. People who depend on violating boundaries often become upset. Their reaction tells you something important. Healthy relationships allow room for disagreement. Manipulative dynamics often treat disagreement as betrayal. That distinction changes everything. Another habit worth developing is separating observation from interpretation. Suppose someone doesn't respond to your message. Observation: they haven't replied. Interpretation: they're ignoring me. Those are not the same thing. Our minds naturally fill information gaps with stories. Sometimes those stories are accurate, sometimes they aren't. Manipulators often exploit this tendency by leaving strategic ambiguity. The less evidence available, the easier it becomes for imagination to complete the picture. Disciplined thinkers resist premature conclusions. They collect evidence before deciding what something means. This habit reduces unnecessary emotional reactions while improving judgment. The sixth rule is mastering emotional pacing. Every interaction has a rhythm. Some people deliberately accelerate conversations because speed favors instinct over analysis, fast decisions, fast commitments, fast emotional escalation. Slowing the rhythm changes the outcome. Speak a little more slowly. Pause before answering. Think before agreeing. Review before signing. Sleep before deciding. Time exposes what pressure tries to hide. Urgency deserves examination, not automatic obedience. There are genuine emergencies, but many situations presented as emergencies are simply someone else's poor planning or preferred strategy. Learning to distinguish between the two protects both your peace and your judgment. Another overlooked skill is becoming comfortable with incomplete information. Many people rush decisions simply because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. Manipulators understand this, offer just enough information to trigger curiosity, just enough scarcity to trigger fear, just enough urgency to trigger action. The mind naturally wants closure. Patient thinkers delay closure until sufficient evidence exists. That patience prevents countless avoidable mistakes. Confidence does not require immediate certainty. It requires trust in your ability to make thoughtful decisions when enough information becomes available. Finally, remember that your reputation is built far more by consistent behavior than by dramatic moments. Small daily choices matter. Keeping promises, arriving on time, speaking truthfully, remaining respectful under pressure, admitting mistakes without collapsing into shame. These habits quietly establish credibility over years. Credibility is difficult to fake, and once established, it becomes one of the strongest forms of influence available. People begin trusting your judgment because your actions repeatedly support your words. That kind of trust cannot be manufactured through clever techniques. It is earned through character. Ironically, character becomes one of the strongest defenses against manipulation because it simplifies decisions. When your values are clear, many difficult choices become obvious. You don't negotiate honesty. You don't negotiate integrity. You don't negotiate respect. The conversation becomes shorter because the internal debate already ended long before the external pressure arrived. One of the most overlooked advantages you can develop is the ability to become emotionally boring to people who are looking for emotional drama. That may sound counterintuitive because modern culture often rewards dramatic reactions. Outrage attracts attention. Instant opinions spread quickly. Public conflict becomes entertainment. Yet people who habitually seek control through emotional turbulence often lose interest when they realize there is no turbulence to amplify. This doesn't mean becoming detached or indifferent. It means becoming intentional. There is a difference between feeling an emotion and allowing that emotion to dictate your next decision. Emotion can provide useful information, but it should not become the sole authority over your behavior. Imagine two people receiving the same criticism. The first immediately interrupts, argues, raises their voice, and begins listing every reason the criticism is unfair. The second listens, asks a clarifying question if necessary, considers whether any part of the feedback is useful, and calmly rejects what isn't. Both people experience the same external event. The difference appeared in the space between stimulus and response. That space is where self-mastery lives. The wider you can make that space, the more freedom you gain. People often believe freedom means doing whatever you feel like doing. A more durable form of freedom is choosing your actions according to your principles rather than your impulses. Impulses are temporary. Principles endure. That distinction becomes especially important when someone attempts to provoke you. Publicly. Public settings create additional psychological pressure because most people fear embarrassment more than almost anything else. A manipulative person may rely on this. They may challenge you in front of others, hoping you'll react emotionally. If you become defensive, they shift the conversation away from the original issue and toward your reaction. This is why composure is such a powerful asset. Composure changes the emotional temperature of a conversation. It doesn't guarantee agreement, but it often prevents unnecessary escalation. Another useful habit is becoming comfortable with brief silence. Many people rush to fill silence because it feels awkward. Yet silence often encourages the other person to keep talking. In doing so, they may reveal more about their intentions, assumptions, or inconsistencies than they originally planned. Listening is frequently underestimated because it doesn't feel as active as speaking. But careful listening gives you information that impulsive talking often gives away. Notice how people describe other individuals. Do they consistently portray themselves as the victim in every story? Do they never acknowledge their own contribution to conflict? Do they frequently divide the world into heroes and villains? Patterns like these deserve attention, not because they prove bad intent, but because they help you understand how someone interprets relationships and responsibility. Another important principle is resisting false urgency around identity. Sometimes manipulation doesn't target your actions first. It targets your self-image. If you were really confident, If you were a loyal friend, if you were successful, the hidden message is that your identity depends on proving something immediately. Healthy confidence doesn't need constant demonstrations. It allows your actions over time to speak louder than attempts to defend your image in the temp. This becomes easier when you stop viewing every interaction as a performance. Not every conversation is an audition. Not every disagreement is a verdict on your worth. Not every criticism is a diagnosis of your character. Some interactions simply reveal differences in perspective. Others reveal incompatible expectations. Learning the difference reduces unnecessary emotional weight. One of the strongest internal questions you can develop is remarkably simple. What outcome am I actually trying to achieve? Without a clear objective, conversations often drift toward emotional reactions instead of productive decisions. If your goal is understanding, your approach will differ from if your goal is solving a problem. If your goal is preserving a relationship, your language will differ from if your goal is establishing a boundary. Clarity of purpose creates clarity of behavior. Confusion about purpose often creates unnecessary conflict. Another valuable skill is recognizing the difference between confidence and certainty. Confident people are often willing to say, "I don't know." Insecure certainty pretends to know everything, because admitting uncertainty feels threatening. This willingness to update your views based on evidence is a strength, not a weakness. It protects you from becoming trapped by pride. Manipulation often succeeds when people become emotionally committed to defending a value, instead of objectively evaluating new information. Flexibility rooted in evidence is more resilient than stubbornness rooted in ego. There is also tremendous value in choosing your environment carefully. Your surroundings influence your thinking more than you may realize. If the people around you constantly normalize chaos, disrespect, dishonesty, or emotional games, those behaviors gradually begin to feel ordinary. The opposite is also true. When you consistently spend time with emotionally mature people, you begin absorbing healthier patterns of communication, accountability, and mutual respect. Environment shapes expectations. Expectations shape behavior. Behavior shapes outcomes. This is why selecting relationships deserves careful attention. Trust should develop through consistent experience, not instant emotional chemistry. Strong first impressions can be genuine. They can also be misleading. Allow time to reveal patterns. Time has a remarkable ability to expose inconsistencies that excitement initially conceals. Patience is often underestimated because it appears passive. In reality, patience is active observation. It gives reality enough time to become visible. There is another habit that strengthens judgment. Ask yourself what incentives exist. People generally move toward what they value. That doesn't mean everyone acts selfishly all the time, but incentives influence behavior. When someone's advice consistently benefits them more than it benefits you, it's reasonable to examine it carefully. That isn't cynicism. It's discernment. Discernment doesn't assume bad intentions. It simply refuses to ignore relevant information. Likewise, avoid becoming the kind of person who manipulates others. The same skills that help you recognize unhealthy influence should also encourage self-reflection. Do you pressure people when you fear rejection? Do you use guilt instead of honest requests? Do you become passive-aggressive instead of expressing disappointment directly? Everyone has blind spots. Strength includes the willingness to examine your own behavior with the same honesty you apply to others. Healthy influence is transparent. It respects choice. It welcomes questions. It allows disagreement without punishment. Those qualities build lasting trust because they create psychological safety. People feel free to think independently, rather than feeling pressured to conform. Over time, your greatest protection isn't a clever phrase or a perfect response. It's becoming someone whose emotional balance, clear values, thoughtful judgment, and consistent behavior make manipulation increasingly ineffective. When your decisions are guided by reflection rather than impulse, when your confidence comes from integrity rather than approval, and when your relationships are built on mutual respect instead of emotional leverage, many of the tactics that once felt overwhelming begin to lose their influence, not because you've learned to control other people, but because you've learned to govern yourself.